And joining us now is Janice Stein, TVO's own foreign affairs analyst, co-author of The Unexpected War, Canada in Kandahar. Good to see you again, Janice.
Great to be here, Steve.
I want to go back to 9/11. The days after 9/11, the emerging story among the political and military leaders in Canada was that Canada was going to be shut out of some kind of meaningful role in Afghanistan. Why was the Canadian government of the day, you suggest, begging to get a piece of that action?
It was, in fact, the impact of 9/11. Tony Blair had come to Washington before our own prime minister. There was the feeling that our special relationship with the United States was at risk. We wanted very much to be part of the big coalition that George Bush was assembling. Hard to think back to that time, before Iraq, before the controversy, worldwide support for the United States. Canada very much wanted in, Steve.
You quote Bill Graham, who was with the Liberal government at the time, saying, "There was no question, every time we talked about the Afghan mission, it gave us cover for not going to Iraq." Are we in Afghanistan because it was a political solution to our relationship with the Americans?
That's too simple, but there is some truth to that comment. The whole discussion about Afghanistan was framed by the Canada-US relationship. And we had said no to the United States about Iraq. We'd also said no, after a long, agonizing process, about ballistic missile defense, BMD. So there certainly was a feeling that we had to do something. But in conversations with officials in the Martin government, both on the political side and the ministers involved, the sense was we would have been doing something in Afghanistan even if Iraq had not happened. So this certainly gave huge impetus to it, but it's not the whole story.
Let's go to January 8th, 2003. The defense minister of the day for this country, John McCallum, has a meeting with his U.S. counterpart, Don Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld says that he wants Canada's help in Afghanistan. McCallum says, if we do Afghanistan, we will not have anything left for Iraq. And you've got Rumsfeld replying, yeah, I know that. If that's true,
it is.
Well, then why did official America blow a gasket when Jean Chrétien declined to get this country involved in Iraq?
They didn't blow a gasket, actually.
Sure sounded like they blew a gasket.
Well, they didn't blow a gasket about us not providing troops for the mission. As we say in the book, right from the January on, it was clear we were not going to do that. What did they want from Prime Minister Chrétien? And it's not a small thing they wanted. They wanted Canada's political support. And as that countdown to March happened, Prime Minister Chrétien, whose visceral instinct all along was, this doesn't sound good to me. This is not the way we go. And he did so much on the basis of his instinct. It became absolutely clear to him that we were not going to provide the political support. Even that the Bush administration could have lived with. Why they blew the gasket was the indiscipline afterwards of members of the Liberal caucus and some very indiscreet, taunting remarks made by people, because we had given our word to the Bush administration that even though we couldn't support the mission, we would do our best to be as constructive as possible.
And not rub their noses in it.
And not rub their noses in it.
And there were some people here who did rub their noses in it.
Absolutely, and they were not called to account by the Prime Minister.
Also on the topic of alienating Washington, Canada said no to Iraq, and you say life went on.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I do remember at the time, if you were a Canadian business person, particularly if you had a business close to the border, and you were trying to do business in the United States, you lost business at that time because the Americans were mad at us for rubbing their noses in Iraq.
Well, you know, that story sounds a lot more organized than in fact it really was. First of all, the American government was not sending that message to any American businessman. Make it tough for the Canadians.
They probably didn't have to.
They didn't have to, nor were they, because as we said, they knew all along what the deal was. Out of the gate, they didn't want our troops. They wanted us in Afghanistan. And number two, they were prepared to live even without the political support. I'm sure there were individual cases, and we were told about them, where Americans, both in business and in the military, snubbed Canadians. This was short-lived. This was probably one of the most significant decisions any government has taken since 1867 to say no to the United States.
And do you think it was
limited consequences?
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Was it consequence-free?
No, nothing is ever consequence-free, but on the scale, extraordinarily limited. The argument we were having, Steve, was with ourselves. The United States was not really, the government was not really part of it.
And yet, despite the fact that you say official Washington did not blow a gasket and that it was relatively consequence-free, there was still the sense in this country that we had to do something to
Yes.
assuage the White House.
Yes.
Why does that feeling always persist?
The United States is our most important friend. It's our biggest trading partner. We share a continent. We have ties of friendship. So there was always a sense, ever since we were born as a country, frankly, there's always been the sense that we need to carve out our own space, but we share space. The second issue really was that Afghanistan was something this government had committed to from November 2001. We went early in, early out, came out after 6 months. We went in again, 2003. General Hillier was the commander of ISAF. This was a mission we had our eyes on right from the beginning. And somebody like Tim Murphy, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff at the time, said, no, we were always going to do something. It was only a question of what.
You mentioned the Chief of Defense Staff, Rick Hillier.
Yes.
And I want to read a quote now from your book attributed to Paul Martin. We're calling this one The PM in the CDS. The PM said this, Paul Martin, I want in, but I want out.
Right.
We do peacemaking and reconstruction and win hearts and minds. I'm going to make a demand on Darfur soon. And you have to tell me, Mr. CDS, that I can have all the troops I need. And you must have the capacity for Haiti if that blows up again. I told him none of this could be constrained by Afghanistan or I wouldn't agree to the mission. So said Paul Martin at the time.
Right.
We are hip deep in Afghanistan. We never did go to Darfur. So I'm wondering, did Paul Martin get snookered by General Hillier?
Well, let me tell you the last part of that conversation that you didn't read. General Hillier said, yes,
Yes, he
I
did.
give you my word.
Right.
So I asked General Hillier in the interviews that we were doing, that wasn't the case, was it? And he said, no, I was wrong. I underestimated the amount, the human resources, in other words, the boots on the ground, and the material that this mission in Afghanistan would consume.
The general said this?
Yes. Openly, honestly, he said, I was just wrong. I underestimated.
So you don't think he tried to deceive the Prime Minister of the day?
No. General Hillier is a strikingly honest, direct person. He tells you what he thinks and what he sees. You may like it, you may not like it, but he's direct.
You have no doubt heard the expression that the force shapes the mission. And I want to know, how much does the Chief of Defense Staff's vision of what the military needs shape the kinds of missions that this country can engage in?
Oh, it has huge impact. It has a huge impact. The fundamental job of the CDS in this country is not to tell the government where to go, but it is to tell the government if we can go and do what the government wants us to do. So when General Hillier's asked, do we have the operational capacity to do this? And they're always asked. He can say yes, he can say no, and he can say yes if we get helicopters and more manpower.
Does that sound like the generals are running things more than they ought to be?
No, that is the fundamental responsibility of a CDS, is to provide the operational military advice. The worst thing that can happen to this country, and it happened to the United States, is for the government to commit to a mission which has inadequate resources, inadequate capabilities. In the United States, the generals knew that the forces going into Iraq were too few. They didn't speak out. That is the worst thing. It's a failure on the part of generals.
But who decides in this country what equipment we purchase?
It's always the military.
Okay.
Because that's their area of expertise.
All
Like
right.
asking a doctor,
Well,
what equipment do you need to perform this operation?
But that's my point. If the military decides what equipment we need, they're in effect telling the politicians, you can go here, you can't go here, because we haven't got the equipment to go here.
There's creative tension here, Steve.
No kidding.
You know why? Because getting the equipment is sometimes a 5 to 10 year lead. And so you have to make these decisions. And then when the Prime Minister says, can we do this? They say, no, we don't have the equipment, right? So there is creative tension, but it is still a fundamental job of the military. That's what they know. That's their expertise. That's the advice we need from them.
As an aside on this issue of Paul Martin and Afghanistan, you suggested in the book that Paul Martin's lack of interest in the Afghan mission stemmed in part because he saw this as Jean Chrétien's foreign policy commitment, not his. The Liberal Party's internecine leadership battles were at play in our Afghanistan policy?
It's very difficult to take the politics out of policy on almost any issue. You're going to be talking later in the program about the Manley Report. It's a substantive report which recommends a clear way forward, takes place against a political context in the country. That's always the case.
A hangover from Iraq. Here's another quote. The Canadian military leadership was so obsessed with its relationship with Pentagon that it was willing to risk its own credibility with its political masters. Military leaders tried to drive foreign policy in the direction they wanted it to go, not normally an appropriate role for the military in a democracy. One senior official said that the DND gets the militaries of other countries to pressure and lobby Ottawa on its behalf.
That was probably the tensest period in this whole story. That was before General Hillier became CDS. It was during the Iraq and the BMD period. There was no doubt that under General Hanot, the military leadership, one, wanted us to join the coalition against Iraq, and two, wanted us to sign on to BMD. There's no question that in individual cases, individual leaders, military leaders, close friends in the United States worked together over the years, trained together in some cases.
Whose side are these guys on?
Well, there was an issue here during this period. This is the one period, I would argue, when there were real issues of civilian control of the military. In their view, this is what they thought we should be doing. It was inconceivable to them that a government of Canada would not join this coalition. So they made forward arrangements, they put the pieces in place. Now, strictly speaking, when they got the word from the Prime Minister we're not going, they fell into line in a minute. It's very important. That period of our history tells us how important it is to have strong civilian leadership, both inside the department and in the minister's office.
Here's a partial list of what you say has resulted as a result of our going to Afghanistan. It has changed the public perception of the military from a peacekeeping and humanitarian force to a full-scale combat and counterinsurgency warfare force. It has, of course, politically divided the Liberal Party of Canada, and it has started a debate about the appropriate role for Canada and its military. Let's pick this apart, Janice. How well prepared are the Canadian forces to fight counterinsurgency wars going forward?
This was the first counterinsurgency we fought, really the first one that we fought as an independent country. You know, we'd have to go back to the Boer War. And so how well prepared were we? There have been a lot of operational, tactical, and strategic surprises. And our military, in fact, is learning as it goes here. So some of what's happened in Afghanistan, in Kandahar, is in part because we've never done this before. A lot of our doctrine we borrowed from the United States. Our equipment is not right. The biggest problem we're having, Stephen, the Manley Report speaks directly to this, is not in the military, though. Our institutions are not configured to manage an insurgency.
Which institutions?
CETA, Foreign Affairs, DND are still not, and it's gotten better since I finished the book. There's been some real progress. They're still not where they need to be. They don't have the flexibility, they're not nimble enough. We still have silo government. That's probably our biggest challenge.
Well, let me pursue that political angle then. Is there a vigorous debate going on in this country between, say, the current Prime Minister, the current Defense Minister, the current Foreign Minister, the current Chief of Defense Staff, about the appropriate role for Canada's military in the 21st century?
That debate actually happened under the Martin government, led by Rick Hillier, because he wrote the Defense Policy Statement, which was a transformational, visionary document. It was his vision about the role of the Canadian military, failed and failing states, fighting what is called a three-block war: humanitarian assistance on one block, combat assistance on the other, emergency relief and stabilization on the third block, all within 3 blocks. There's a lead time between that vision and changing the military capabilities, the strategy, the tactics of our military, and not everybody accepts General Hillier's vision. So we are in the middle of debate where we haven't had the debate yet. We haven't had it in CETA. We have a development program that says long-term development. Reluctantly, in the last 2 years, they've moved into reconstruction. In fact, the military is ahead of the other institutions, not behind, right now in the country.
Another quote from your book, The Unexpected War. Canada is now at war.
Yeah.
Canada slipped into war in Afghanistan, step by step, incrementally, without fully understanding that it was going to war, until it woke up to mounting casualties and grim battles. Paul Martin looked back at the decision-making process and saw the gaps. We didn't have detailed discussions about the challenges of Afghanistan. Given how we got there, the high expense in blood and treasure since we've been there, a lot of casualties, do you support this mission?
I do. with all the reservations that were expressed in the Manley Report and some others as well, this part of the world, Afghanistan, Pakistan, is one of the most severely troubled parts of the world. It's got the most unlit fuses of any part of the world right now, even more than the Middle East, if that's, the Middle East has been so long the center of everybody's attention. It's actually this part of the world where the dynamite is, and it just takes a match to light the fuses. We walked away from it once before, Steve. Everybody paid an enormous price for walking away. I don't believe we should walk away again, but we have to change things in order to improve the effectiveness. And that's really what the Manley Report deals with.
Do you agree with its chief recommendation that we should stay beyond 2009 if we can get other NATO allies to sign on?
I agree with its 3 recommendations. They're all chief. That's one. I certainly do. Burden sharing in NATO is a disgrace. The UN, the performance of the UN, frankly, on the ground is abysmal, despite some very talented people we have there. Manley also says, he's a little politer than I'm going to be, he also says very strongly, we need to fix our institutions at home. We are not managing. The Prime Minister's got to take personal ownership, personal responsibility for this. We have to fix this. And the second thing he says very, very clearly, if we don't get some coordination of the international donors, and if NATO and ISAF and the UN and the Afghan National Army cannot get their act together, we will not succeed. All 3 of those pieces have to be in place.
Can you
Big
imagine,
challenge.
though, can you imagine this country pulling out troops in February 2009, even if other NATO partners don't pony up?
Well, let me reverse your question. I am very confident that we will have those 1,000 troops. I am very confident we will get the helicopters and the UAVs. That's not the big challenge. The real challenge is, can we do what we need to do at home, and can we use every bit of diplomatic muscle that we have? And we have it now, Steve, because we've been in Afghanistan through tough times. Can we use every bit of diplomatic muscle we have to force that kind of coordination internationally? That's the real challenge for us.
Well, we've been in Afghanistan, but of course we took a pass on Iraq, and we haven't been in Kosovo, and there have been other places, you know, dangerous places around the world where we also have not been.
Yes.
So I wonder how, you know, how much, I don't think cachet is the right word,
Clout.
but how much clout do we in fact have internationally to do the kind of robust diplomacy you're talking about?
We do. We have now enormous clout in NATO, which we didn't have before, and that's a result of participating in the Afghan mission. We have actually clout in Washington because Washington is finally, belatedly, too late almost, turning its attention to Afghanistan. So we are in a position, if we use the leverage we have, really to insist on better coordination on in those 2 areas, donors and on the military side.
I'm going to ask the question a lot of Canadians are asking, and in doing so, read an excerpt from your book. The question is the mission doomed? Here's the quote. Is it possible that any outside intervention, no matter what its purpose, no matter how principled its intent, is doomed because it will be seen as a white, Western expedition that forces its say where it is unwanted? Is outside intervention doomed because it disrupts and destabilizes with very limited capacity to replace what it breaks? You've asked some good questions. What are the answers?
That's the most serious worry that I came out of doing the research with, Steve, and I can't give an unequivocal answer. What I can say, and I'm pleased to see in the Manley Report that there's an echo of this, we need to be very modest in our ambitions. We need to understand what the mission of our forces is. It's to contain the insurgency while we help the Afghans build a state that suits them, that looks like them, that reflects their history, their culture, their practices, and stand way back and not try to make Afghans look like us. If we try to make Afghans look like us, it is doomed.
I want to quote an Afghan, whom you quoted in the book, a guy named Fareed. Mm-hmm. If the international forces leave, the central government will collapse. Millions of people will be displaced. For the time being, nation building in Afghanistan is like a child. If you do not support a child, teach it how to walk, it cannot stand on its own 2 feet. Afghanistan is your child. You agree?
Yes. We participated in a coalition that broke that government. And we said to the Afghans, there's a better future The big challenge is to give them enough time so that, one, they can build an army. It's their country, their army. And then recognize that what it looks like at the end has to fit Afghanistan, not Canada, not the United States, not Western Europe.
Does it sound a titch paternalistic to describe Afghanistan as our child, even though it's his words?
It's his words. That's what's really interesting. You know what he was really saying? He's a wonderful, wonderful person who works with people who are displaced by the fighting and helps them to build emergency shelters, you know, with molds made of clay, Steve. 2-room houses, no kitchen, no running water, no bathroom. He's just a wonderful, wonderful man. What he was really saying is, you're responsible. You need to take some responsibility for what you've done. And he's right.
Janice Stein with Eugene Lang, co-authors of The Unexpected War, Canada in Kandahar. As always, thanks for coming into TVO, Janice.
You're welcome.